Tonight, as you close your eyes and allow the world around you to soften, let us step back in time together. Imagine the hills of southern France, where the air is scented with lavender and stone villages rest quietly under the warm sun. In these valleys and mountains, nearly 1,000 years ago, a different vision of faith blossomed. It was a vision that promised purity, simplicity, and freedom from the heavy burdens of a world full of corruption. This vision belonged to a people who came to be known as the Cathars. The Cathars are often remembered as heretics, condemned by the powerful church of their age. But to understand them only as rebels is to miss the heart of their story. They were seekers of light, men and women who believed that the soul was trapped in the prison of the material world, and that salvation came not from power or wealth, but from inner knowledge and purity of spirit. They lived in towns and villages across the Languedoc region of France, and for more than a century they flourished, offering an alternative way of life and belief that both fascinated and frightened their neighbors. Our journey tonight will be slow and gentle. We will not rush through battles or dates. Instead, we will move carefully, as though turning the fragile pages of an old manuscript. We will explore who the Cathars were, what they believed, how they lived, and why they faced such brutal opposition. We will walk with them as their communities grew, and we will watch as they were crushed under the weight of crusades and inquisitions, and at the end, we will reflect on what remains of their legacy long after the fires of persecution have died out. As you listen, you may find yourself drifting, your mind wandering into dream. That is as it should be. The story is here for you, whether you follow every detail or only catch gentle fragments before sleep takes you. Like the quiet rhythm of a lullaby, the rise and fall of this history can soothe and calm. You need not hold on to every word. The story itself will hold you. The Cathars appeared in a time when Europe was both restless and alive with change. The Catholic Church was powerful, yet often criticized for its wealth and corruption. Feudal lords fought for land and influence, while peasants bore the weight of their struggles. In this world, a movement of spiritual purity was bound to attract attention. And so the Cathars came to offer a vision that stood apart from the mainstream. A dualistic faith that saw the material world as the flawed creation of a lesser power and the spiritual realm as the true home of the soul. To the Catholic hierarchy, such teachings were dangerous. They challenged the authority of priests and sacraments, and they offered ordinary people the chance to connect directly with the divine without the mediation of the Church. But to many in Languedoc, the Cathars were not enemies. They were neighbors, friends, and family members. They were healers and teachers, respected for their honesty and their refusal to live in excess. In their simplicity, they seemed to embody the virtues that others felt the established church had forgotten. As we begin this journey, let the world of the Cathars unfold slowly before you. Picture the rolling countryside of Occitania, the soft songs in the Occitan language, the narrow streets where merchants and travellers crossed paths. Imagine the evenings when villagers gathered to hear the words of the perfecti, the spiritual leaders of the Cathar faith, who preached not of power but of peace, not of wealth but of release from the prison of flesh. Their words stirred hope in many and suspicion in others. This is the story we will follow tonight, a story of faith and conflict, of dreams and destruction, of memory and silence. It is a story that has often been forgotten, buried beneath the judgments of history. But tonight, we will bring it back to life, gently, step by step, like a lantern glowing in the dark. So, breathe deeply, settle into the comfort of your bed. Allow your thoughts to slow. The Cathars are waiting for us across the centuries. Their story begins now. Before we can understand the Cathars, we must first pause and look at the world into which they were born. It was a Europe both familiar and strange, caught between the shadows of the ancient world and the dawn of something new. This was the 12th century, an age of castles and cathedrals, of wandering troubadours, of kings and knights, of peasants who tilled the soil under heavy skies. The rhythms of life were steady and slow, yet beneath the surface there were currents of change. Religion was at the center of almost everything. The Catholic Church was not simply a spiritual institution, it was the backbone of European society. From the smallest village chapel to the soaring cathedrals that reached toward heaven, the Church claimed authority over the soul and, by extension, much of daily life. It blessed marriages, judged disputes, and promised salvation. The Pope in Rome was not just a bishop among bishops, but the supreme shepherd of Christendom, whose words could command kings and armies. And yet, not all was harmonious. Many people, from humble peasants to educated clerics, felt unease. The Church, so powerful and so wealthy, often seemed far removed from the humility of the gospel. Bishops wore fine robes, monasteries accumulated land, and even local priests were sometimes accused of greed or corruption. The gap between the ideals of Christianity and the realities of the institution was noticed, even if few dared to speak of it aloud. Beyond religion, the structure of society was built upon feudal bonds. Lords and vassals held power through land, knights defended their masters, and peasants worked the fields. It was a rigid hierarchy, one in which social mobility was rare. Yet within this order, small cracks appeared. Cities grew, trade routes expanded, and merchants began to carve out spaces of influence that did not fit neatly within the old system. Southern France, especially the region known as Languedoc, stood apart from much of Europe. It was a land of mild climate, fertile soil, and bustling towns. Here, Occitan was spoken, a lyrical language of poetry and song. Troubadours composed verses of love and longing, and culture flourished in ways that seemed lighter, freer than the harsher lands to the north. The people of Languedoc valued independence. Local lords often resisted outside control, whether from the French crown or the distant Pope. It was in this environment, more open and questioning, that alternative religious ideas could take root. At the same time, Europe was alive with spiritual ferment. Ancient texts from Greece and Rome were being rediscovered. Contact with the Muslim world through Spain and the Crusades brought new philosophies and sciences. In quiet monasteries, scholars copied manuscripts that would later form the foundations of universities. Ideas were circulating, whispered, written, and debated, and among them were teachings that questioned the very nature of the world, of matter, and of spirit. It was in this atmosphere that dualist ideas, beliefs that the material world was flawed or evil, and that the true home of the soul was elsewhere, found listeners. These ideas were not new. They traced back to ancient philosophies, to Manichaeans, and to other mystical traditions. In the Balkans, a group known as the Bogomils kept such teachings alive, and from there, carried along trade routes and through wandering preachers, they reached the fertile soil of southern France. For ordinary people of the 12th century, daily life was filled with hardship. Disease, famine, and war were constant threats. Life expectancy was short, and suffering was common. In such a world, the promise of a faith that explained suffering as part of a larger cosmic struggle and offered hope for liberation of the soul was deeply attractive. If the Church seemed distant or compromised, perhaps a simpler, purer way could be found. And so, as the sun set over the rolling hills of Languedoc, a quiet movement began to take shape. Men and women gathered to listen to preachers who spoke of two realms, one of light, one of darkness. They spoke of a God beyond this world, of purity and compassion, of rejecting the corruptions of material life. It was here, in this medieval world of faith and doubt, that the Cathars would emerge. To understand the Cathars, one must journey further back, to the ancient currents of thought that flowed quietly beneath the surface of European history. These currents were not always visible, but they shaped minds and hearts, carrying fragments of ideas across centuries and continents. The Cathars did not invent dualism, the belief in two opposing principles of good and evil, but inherited it from traditions much older, stretching into the distant past. Long before medieval France, in the lands of the Near East and the Mediterranean, thinkers and mystics wrestled with the great question of suffering. If the world was made by a good and loving God, why did it contain so much pain, injustice, and death? The answer for some was that the world was not the creation of a perfect being at all. Rather, it was shaped by a flawed or even hostile power, and the true God remained far above, unreachable except through secret knowledge. This was the essence of Gnosticism, a movement that arose in the early centuries of the Common Era. Gnostics believed that the material world was a prison, a shadow realm that distracted souls from their divine origin. They taught that within each person burned a hidden spark of light, a fragment of the true God, waiting to be awakened. Salvation did not come through rituals or obedience to institutions, but through gnosis, direct knowledge, and inner awakening. To the Gnostics, figures like Christ were not merely saviors who died to redeem humanity, but messengers who revealed the hidden truth, that the world of matter was the domain of a lesser being, often called the demiurge. This demiurge, arrogant and ignorant, believed himself to be the only God, but in truth he was only a craftsman of flesh, binding souls in chains of matter. The real God, vast and unknowable, dwelled in realms of pure light. Although suppressed by the growing authority of the Catholic Church, echoes of Gnosticism never vanished entirely. Some of its texts were buried in jars in the Egyptian desert, rediscovered only in the 20th century. But its spirit lingered, woven into other traditions, whispered in quiet corners where official doctrine could not reach. Centuries later, in the rugged mountains of the Balkans, another dualist faith arose, the Bogomils. Emerging in the 10th century, they preached that the visible world was under the rule of Satan, while the true God reigned far above. Like the Gnostics, they rejected the materialism and hierarchy of the established church. They denied the power of priests, scorned the worship of images, and called for a return to simplicity, humility, and purity. The Bogomils spread their message across Bulgaria, Macedonia, and beyond. They were often persecuted, yet they persisted, moving quietly from village to village, passing down their teachings through song and story. To their followers, the Bogomils offered clarity. The world was filled with suffering because it was under the dominion of an evil power. But the soul, divine and eternal, could resist and return to God through a life of purity, fasting, and prayer. It was along the busy routes of trade and pilgrimage that Bogomil ideas traveled westward. Merchants, wanderers, and itinerant preachers carried these teachings across mountains and rivers until they reached the more tolerant lands of southern France. There, amid the independent spirit of Languedoc, they found fertile ground. The language of light and darkness, of spirit and matter, resonated with those who already questioned the wealth and power of the Catholic clergy. Dualism, at its core, gave meaning to human suffering. It said, "Your pain is not meaningless. Your struggles are not the will of a good God who wishes you to suffer. Instead, they are the mark of a cosmic battle, and you are part of it. By turning away from corruption, by seeking purity, you align yourself with the realm of light." In this vision, salvation was not something granted by a distant institution, but something lived daily in choices and sacrifices. These ancient and medieval dualist movements would form the spiritual backbone of Cathar belief. The Cathars, inheriting fragments of Gnosticism and Bogomil wisdom, reshaped them into a faith uniquely suited to their time and place. Their vision of the universe was stark: two powers locked in struggle, matter versus spirit, darkness versus light. And within this grand conflict, every soul had a choice to make. The Cathar worldview was strikingly different from that of the Catholic Church. To step into their theology is to step into a universe divided sharply between two realms, one of pure light, the other of corrupt darkness. It was a vision both simple and radical, giving profound meaning to the struggles of life, while challenging the very foundations of medieval Christianity. At the center of Cathar belief was dualism. The Cathars taught that there were two powers at work in creation. On one side was the true God, invisible, ineffable, a being of perfect goodness who reigned over the realm of pure spirit. On the other was the ruler of this world, a dark power, often identified with Satan, who had fashioned the material universe as a prison for souls. To the Cathars, everything physical, the earth, the body, even the church's sacraments and institutions, was stained by this evil origin. This belief offered a startling explanation for the suffering that seemed to dominate medieval life. Why were there plagues, famines, and endless wars? Why did the innocent suffer alongside the guilty? The Cathars answered, because the world itself was flawed. It was not created by a loving father, but by a hostile power who trapped divine sparks inside perishable bodies. Each human soul, they believed, carried within it a fragment of that higher spiritual light, longing to escape the cycle of reincarnation and return to its true home. Salvation, then, was not about forgiveness of sins through the sacraments of the Church. It was not about penance, confession, or even the Eucharist. For the Cathars, salvation meant liberation, the freeing of the soul from the prison of matter. This liberation could only be achieved through knowledge, purity, and a rejection of the material temptations that bound one to the dark power. In this light, the figure of Christ took on a unique role. The Catholic Church taught that Jesus was the incarnate Son of God, who lived, suffered, died on the cross, and rose again in the flesh. The Cathars, however, denied the incarnation entirely. To them, it was unthinkable that the pure Son of the true God would enter a body of corrupt matter. Instead, they believed that Christ appeared in the world only as a spirit, an illusion of flesh, whose mission was to reveal the truth about the prison of matter and to guide souls back toward the realm of light. This reinterpretation of Christ was deeply offensive to Catholic authorities, but it was entirely consistent with Cathar dualism. If matter was evil, then God could never have taken on a human body. For the Cathars, the crucifixion was not the heart of salvation, but a misunderstanding. The real gift of Christ was his teaching, his revelation of hidden truth, his reminder that the kingdom of God was not of this world. The Cathar view of life followed naturally from their theology. Marriage, for example, was seen as binding souls further into the material cycle, since it produced more bodies in which divine sparks would be trapped. Sexual relations, food indulgence, and luxury were temptations that deepened the soul's imprisonment. The ideal life, according to Cathar teaching, was one of abstinence, fasting, and simplicity. Yet the Cathars were not joyless. Their emphasis on compassion and equality was remarkable for their time. Men and women were regarded as spiritual equals, both capable of reaching the highest state of purity. The Cathar clergy, known as the perfecti, lived lives of strict asceticism, renouncing wealth, possessions, and physical pleasures. They served as guides and examples for the credentes, the ordinary believers, who admired their purity even if they could not live it themselves. Central to the Cathar faith was a single sacrament, the consolamentum. This rite was both baptism and ordination, a laying on of hands through which the believer received the Holy Spirit and became one of the perfect. For many, it was taken only on the deathbed, as it required a complete renunciation of the material world. But whether received early or late, it was seen as the soul's gateway to freedom. The Cathar vision of God and the world was, in many ways, a rebellion against the dominant order. Where the Church saw creation as good, they saw it as corrupt. Where the Church emphasized obedience to hierarchy, they emphasized equality and purity. Where the Church looked to sacraments and institutions, they looked inward to the hidden spark within each soul. This stark and beautiful vision drew many to their side, but it also placed them on a collision course with the Catholic Church, which could not tolerate such a challenge to its authority. For to accept the Cathar worldview was not just to adopt a different theology, it was to reject the very foundations of Christendom. The Cathars were not merely a community of ideas. They lived their beliefs with a seriousness that astonished both admirers and opponents. Their way of life, though simple, was profoundly different from that of their Catholic neighbors. It was this contrast between the grandeur of the Church and the humble purity of the Cathars that gave their movement both its strength and its vulnerability. At the heart of Cathar society were two groups, the perfecti and the credentes. The perfecti, or perfect ones, were the spiritual elite, men and women who had received the consolamentum and committed themselves fully to the Cathar path. They renounced the world, embracing strict poverty, chastity, and non-violence. They owned nothing, ate sparingly, and wandered from town to town, preaching, teaching, and offering comfort. Their very lives were intended to be living sermons, showing that it was possible to resist the corruption of the material world. The credentes, or believers, formed the broader base of Cathar communities. They admired and supported the perfecti, often providing them with food, shelter, and protection. Many of the credentes lived ordinary lives, farming, raising families, conducting trade. But they drew inspiration from the perfecti, and many hoped to one day receive the consolamentum themselves, often on their deathbeds. This structure allowed the Cathar faith to spread widely without requiring every follower to adopt the full ascetic life immediately. Daily practices among the perfecti were marked by discipline and devotion. They fasted frequently, avoiding meat, dairy, and rich foods, which they believed tied the soul to the cycle of matter. Simplicity was their guiding principle. Simple clothing, simple meals, simple speech. They rejected swearing oaths, believing that truth should stand on its own without the need for binding promises. Violence was forbidden, not just in action, but in spirit. To harm another was to further the power of darkness. Despite these restrictions, the Cathars were not dour. Contemporary accounts, even from hostile clerics, describe the perfecti as gentle, compassionate, and admired by those around them. Their lives of purity stood in stark contrast to the wealth of bishops and priests, who often lived in comfort, collected tithes, and wielded political power. It was not difficult for ordinary people to see in the Cathars a closer reflection of the humility of Christ and his apostles. One of the most striking aspects of Cathar life was their treatment of women. In an age when the Catholic Church barred women from the priesthood and restricted their authority, the Cathars allowed women to become perfecti, fully initiated spiritual leaders. Women could preach, perform the consolamentum, and guide communities, holding equal authority with men. This spiritual equality resonated deeply, especially in a society where many women longed for greater dignity and recognition. Cathar communities were often close-knit, built on trust and mutual support. The perfecti relied on the generosity of the credentes, while the credentes found comfort and meaning in the teachings of the perfecti. Together they formed an alternative society, a spiritual family bound not by wealth or power, but by shared belief. Gatherings were often simple, held in homes or quiet places, where hymns were sung, scriptures read, and teachings passed down by word of mouth. The central rite of the consolamentum was both awe-inspiring and solemn. For those who received it, life changed forever. The initiate would kneel while perfecti laid hands upon them, invoking the Holy Spirit. From that moment, they were considered reborn, no longer bound to the material world, but living already in the light of God. To break the vows afterward was unthinkable, for it risked eternal imprisonment in the cycle of matter. For this reason, many chose to wait until their final days, when they could die purified and free. Of course, Cathar life was not without difficulty. Their rejection of the material world meant they often lived in poverty, relying on others' kindness. Their refusal to swear oaths placed them at odds with feudal society, where loyalty was bound by such promises. Their avoidance of violence made them vulnerable in a time when power was often won and kept by the sword. Yet it was precisely this vulnerability, this refusal to compromise, that gave their witness such power. The Cathar way of life stood as a quiet challenge to the world around them. In the simplicity of their clothing, the gentleness of their speech, and the equality of their communities, they offered an alternative vision of what Christianity could be. For many, this vision was not only attractive, but liberating. It spoke of a faith stripped of corruption, a faith that lived not in stone cathedrals but in hearts and homes. It was this way of life, as much as their theology, that made the Cathars a threat to the Catholic Church. For here was a movement that captured the imagination of the people, not with power or wealth, but with humility and purity. And it is here, in their daily lives, that we glimpse why the Cathars spread so widely and why they inspired such fierce loyalty among their followers. To the Catholic Church of the 12th and 13th centuries, the Cathars were not merely a curious sect with unusual beliefs. They were a direct and dangerous challenge to the very foundations of Christendom. The Church saw in them not only theological error, but the seeds of rebellion, a movement that could undermine its authority, its structure, and its role in society. First and foremost, Cathar theology contradicted the Church's central teachings. The Catholic faith was built upon the belief that God had created the world and declared it good, that Christ had taken on human flesh, died on the cross, and risen again in the body. These were not minor points of doctrine. They were the very heart of Christian identity. The Cathars, by denying the incarnation, by rejecting the cross, and by declaring the material world evil, struck at the roots of the faith as the Church understood it. But theology was only part of the concern. The Cathars also undermined the Church's sacramental system. The Church taught that salvation was mediated through the sacraments: baptism, confession, Eucharist, marriage, and more, all administered by the priesthood. This system gave the clergy their authority, for they were seen as necessary channels of divine grace. The Cathars, however, dismissed nearly all of these sacraments. They held only to the consolamentum, performed by their own leaders, often without formal buildings, altars, or priests. In doing so, they bypassed the Church entirely, offering the people a path to salvation without priests, without tithes, without the institution that claimed to hold the keys to heaven. This was a profound threat. If ordinary people began to believe that they could live their faith without the Church, what need would there be for bishops, for abbots, for the Pope himself? The Cathars, by their very existence, questioned the monopoly of spiritual power that the Church had built over centuries. Even more troubling was the Cathar way of life. The perfecti, with their poverty, chastity, and humility, stood in stark contrast to many Catholic clergy, who were often wealthy, politically powerful, and at times corrupt. Ordinary people could not help but notice the difference. A Cathar perfect might arrive at a village barefoot, dressed in simple robes, speaking gently, and living from the generosity of others. A Catholic bishop, by contrast, might pass in a grand procession, clothed in gold and escorted by knights. For many peasants and townsfolk, the choice of who seemed closer to Christ was obvious. The Cathar openness to women also challenged church authority. In Catholicism, the priesthood was reserved exclusively for men, and women were often relegated to supporting roles within convents. But among the Cathars, women could rise to positions of leadership as perfectae, performing the same rites and teaching with the same authority as men. This equality was revolutionary, and it hinted at a different kind of Christian community, one that did not rely on the rigid hierarchies of Rome. Furthermore, the Cathars rejected oaths and violence, both essential to the medieval order. Feudal society was built upon sworn promises of loyalty between lords and vassals. To refuse to swear oaths was, in the eyes of secular rulers, a kind of rebellion. Likewise, in an age of knights and crusades, the refusal to bear arms was seen not as noble pacifism, but as dangerous disloyalty. A community that rejected oaths and violence undermined both church and state, threatening the bonds that held medieval society together. The spread of Catharism in Languedoc added urgency to these concerns. This was not a tiny sect hidden in the shadows. By the late 12th century, Cathar beliefs had penetrated towns, villages, and even noble households. Some lords tolerated or even protected them, either out of sympathy or resistance to outside control. Cathar preachers were welcomed into homes. Their teachings were discussed in marketplaces and fields. The movement had grown too large to ignore. To Catholic leaders, this was nothing less than heresy on a massive scale. And heresy, in their eyes, was not just a mistake. It was a disease that could spread, corrupt, and ultimately destroy the unity of Christendom. The Church believed it had a sacred duty to root out heresy for the sake of souls and for the stability of society. Thus, the Cathars became the focus of increasing hostility. Councils were convened to condemn them, sermons were preached against them, and papal legates were dispatched to confront them. Yet the Cathars continued to grow, for the purity of their lives and the clarity of their message appealed to many. For every denunciation from the pulpit, there seemed to be another village ready to offer shelter to a Cathar preacher. It was only a matter of time before the Church concluded that preaching and persuasion were not enough. If heresy could not be reasoned away, it would have to be crushed. And so, from Rome, plans began to form for a campaign unlike any seen before, a crusade not to the Holy Land, but into the heart of Europe itself. By the early years of the 13th century, the patience of Rome had run out. For decades, the Church had tried to combat Cathar teaching through preaching, councils, and the sending of papal legates. Yet the movement only grew stronger, especially in the fertile lands of Languedoc. It was here, in the sunlit valleys and fortified towns of southern France, that Catharism had found a safe haven. Noble families tolerated or even protected the sect, whether from conviction or from defiance against outside authority. From the papal perspective, this could no longer be ignored. The spark that ignited open conflict came in 1208. Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful and determined popes in history, had sent his legate, Pierre de Castelnau, to negotiate with Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, who was accused of tolerating the Cathars. The negotiations were tense, and Raymond's authority in the region was already fragile. Soon after, Pierre was murdered, likely by knights loyal to the Count. For Innocent, this was the final outrage. The murder of a papal legate was more than a crime. It was an insult to the authority of Rome. Within months, the Pope declared a crusade against the Cathars, calling on the knights and nobles of northern France to take up arms. The rewards were the same as for those who fought in the Holy Land: remission of sins and eternal glory. But there was another incentive as well: lands. The nobles of Languedoc were wealthy and independent, and the Pope promised that their territories could be seized by those who joined the Holy War. Thus began the Albigensian Crusade, named for the town of Albi, a Cathar stronghold. Unlike the distant crusades to Jerusalem, this one took place close to home, in the heart of Europe. French knights, eager for land and divine favour, gathered in great numbers. At their head was Simon de Montfort, a determined and ruthless commander who would soon become the face of the crusade. In 1209, the Crusaders marched south. Their first major target was the city of Béziers, known to harbour a significant Cathar population. As the army surrounded the city, papal legates demanded that the Catholics within hand over the heretics. But the people of Béziers refused, declaring that they would not betray their neighbours. What followed was one of the most infamous massacres of the Middle Ages. When the city fell, the Crusaders killed indiscriminately. Men, women and children were slaughtered, regardless of whether they were Cathar or Catholic. The carnage was so complete that reports claimed the streets ran red with blood. It was during this siege that a papal legate is said to have uttered the chilling words, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Whether the phrase was actually spoken or not, it captured the brutal spirit of the campaign. The sack of Béziers sent shockwaves across Europe. It was both a warning and a promise. The Church would tolerate no defiance, and those who harboured heretics would suffer the same fate. Towns and villages, hearing of the massacre, trembled. Some opened their gates in fear, others prepared for resistance. From Béziers, the Crusaders marched onward, laying siege to Carcassonne. Here, the young Viscount Raymond Roger Trencavel held out, but within weeks he was forced to surrender. Stripped of his lands and thrown into prison, where he soon died, Trencavel's fall symbolized the beginning of the end for the independent lords of Languedoc. Carcassonne was handed to Simon de Montfort, marking the start of a new order in the south. The Albigensian Crusade was unlike the wars to the Holy Land. It was not about distant holy sites, but about neighbours, villages, families and fellow Christians. It turned the land of troubadours and poets into a battlefield. For the Cathars, it was the beginning of a desperate struggle to preserve their faith against overwhelming force. For the Catholic Church, it was a crusade of purification, a holy war to restore unity and crush dissent. As the Crusaders advanced, many ordinary people faced impossible choices. To resist was to risk slaughter. To submit was to betray friends and family who followed the Cathar way. Entire communities were torn apart. Yet even in the face of such violence, Cathar faith did not vanish. Preachers continued to move in secret, believers continued to gather quietly, and the perfecti carried on their mission with calm determination. The crusade had begun, and with it a new chapter in the history of Languedoc, a chapter written in fire, blood, and unyielding faith. The summer of 1209 would become etched into memory as one of the darkest moments in the history of medieval Christendom. The crusading army, summoned by Pope Innocent III, had descended upon the south of France, and their first target was the bustling city of Béziers. This city, with its fortified walls, thriving markets and proud citizens, had long been a stronghold of Cathar belief. But it was not only the Cathars who lived there. Catholics, too, made their homes inside the same walls. The people of Béziers lived as neighbours, bound by kinship, trade, and shared history. When the Crusaders arrived, they demanded the surrender of the Cathars. The papal legates, acting with full authority, gave the citizens an ultimatum: hand over the heretics, and the city would be spared. If they refused, the entire population would face destruction. The townsfolk were faced with a terrible choice. Some pleaded to comply, while others insisted that they could not betray their neighbors and family members. In the end, the city stood together, refusing to turn Cathars over to the Crusaders. To the crusading army, this defiance sealed the city's fate. On July 22nd, 1209, the attack began. The Crusaders stormed the defences, and chaos erupted inside Béziers. The defenders were overwhelmed, and soon the city fell to the invaders. What followed was not battle but massacre. The Crusaders cut down everyone in their path: men, women, children, the elderly, priests, and peasants alike. No house was spared, no church safe. In a matter of hours, Béziers was transformed from a thriving city into a field of corpses. Chroniclers who recorded the events spoke with horror of the slaughter. Tens of thousands were said to have been killed, though the true number was likely lower. Still, the scale of the bloodshed was undeniable. The city itself was set ablaze, its walls torn down, its survivors scattered. It was an annihilation so complete that Béziers ceased to exist as it had before. It was during this massacre that a phrase entered legend. When asked how to distinguish between Catholics and Cathars, a papal legate, often identified as Arnaud Amalric, is said to have replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Whether these exact words were spoken or not, they captured the brutal logic of the crusade. In Béziers, no distinction was made. To the Crusaders, the city had harbored heresy, and so the entire city was condemned. The massacre sent shockwaves far beyond the walls of Béziers. Word spread quickly through Languedoc, carried by refugees and rumours. Entire communities shuddered at the news, knowing that if Béziers could fall, so could they. Some towns, terrified by the fate of their neighbours, opened their gates without resistance when the Crusaders approached. Others prepared desperately for defence, knowing the price of defiance. For the Catholic Church, Béziers was a demonstration of uncompromising authority. It sent a clear message: heresy would not be tolerated, and those who harboured heretics would suffer the same fate. The Pope and his legates justified the slaughter as necessary for the salvation of Christendom, a cleansing fire that would burn away corruption. To the Crusaders, many of whom were motivated as much by land and loot as by faith, Béziers was a triumph, a city claimed and destroyed in God's name. But for the people of Languedoc, the massacre was remembered as a tragedy beyond words. Entire families vanished, entire neighbourhoods were wiped out. The songs of the troubadours, once filled with love and longing, turned to laments of sorrow and loss. The independent spirit of the South, proud and defiant, now lived under the shadow of fear. Yet, despite the horror, the Cathar faith did not die with Béziers. Survivors carried it with them to other towns and villages. Preachers moved quietly through the countryside, offering comfort to those who mourned. The perfecti, even in the face of death, continued their mission. The massacre, rather than extinguishing the movement, hardened the resolve of many. For if the world was truly ruled by darkness, as the Cathars believed, then the flames of Béziers were only proof of that truth. The siege of Béziers was just the beginning of the Albigensian crusade. More towns would fall, more blood would be spilled, and the conflict would rage for decades. But in its scale and cruelty, Béziers stood apart. It was a turning point, a symbol of how far the Church was willing to go to enforce its authority. And it marked the beginning of the long and brutal suppression of the Cathar faith. Among the many knights who answered Pope Innocent III's call to crusade, one man would rise above the rest, shaping the course of the Albigensian crusade through sheer determination and ruthless resolve. His name was Simon de Montfort. Born into a noble family in northern France, Simon was not a man of vast lands or wealth. He was, however, a man of deep piety and unwavering discipline. To his followers, he embodied the very spirit of the crusade, severe, devout, uncompromising. To his enemies, he became a symbol of tyranny and cruelty, a foreign conqueror who brought fire and steel to the peaceful lands of Languedoc. Simon first distinguished himself during the early campaigns of 1209. When the crusading army turned from the ashes of Béziers to the fortified city of Carcassonne, Simon was among those who pressed the attack. Carcassonne, under the young Viscount Raymond de Roger Trinquevel, resisted with courage. But disease, hunger, and the relentless pressure of the Crusaders soon forced surrender. Trinquevel was imprisoned under harsh conditions and died soon after, leaving his lands vulnerable. At this moment, the leadership of the crusade needed a strong hand. Many northern nobles had come south to fight, but few wished to remain and rule the conquered lands. The Pope's legates offered Trinquevel's lands, rich, fertile, and strategically vital, to any leader willing to claim them in the name of the Church. Most hesitated. To rule Languedoc was to invite years of war with the fiercely independent southern lords. Simon de Montfort did not hesitate. He accepted the challenge, swore to defend the Church, and was invested with the title of Viscount of Béziers and Carcassonne. With this act, Simon transformed from crusader to ruler, a man not only fighting for faith, but building a new dominion in the south. Simon's leadership style was stark and uncompromising. He demanded strict discipline from his men, forbidding looting and enforcing obedience. Yet at the same time, he dealt mercilessly with those who resisted. Castles were seized, towns subdued, and enemies executed. To the Cathars, he was the very face of persecution. To the Catholic Church, he was the hammer of heresy, the warrior who would bring order to a rebellious land. The lords of Languedoc, however, were not easily subdued. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, though outwardly submitting to Rome, resented the growing power of Simon. Other nobles, seeing their lands handed over to northern crusaders, began to resist more fiercely. The troubadours of the south sang songs not of Simon's piety, but of his brutality. To them, he was no holy warrior, but a conqueror stripping their homeland of its freedom and traditions. Simon's campaign became one of sieges and skirmishes. Castle by castle, village by village, he extended his control. Some towns surrendered quickly, terrified by the memory of Béziers. Others fought desperately, knowing what surrender could mean. Simon proved himself not only a skilled warrior, but a master of siegecraft, capable of reducing even the strongest fortifications. One of his most notable victories came at Minerve in 1210. The town, perched on a rocky hill, had become a refuge for Cathars. After weeks of siege, its defenders surrendered, and Simon ordered the Cathar prefecti to recant their beliefs. When they refused, over 100 were burned alive. Such uncompromising actions were meant as warnings, demonstrations of absolute authority. Yet Simon's rule was never secure. For every town he captured, another rose in rebellion. For every noble subdued, another plotted revenge. His reliance on northern knights, unfamiliar with southern customs and language, deepened resentment. Even among his allies, there were whispers that Simon's ambition rivaled his piety. Still, for nearly a decade, Simon de Montfort remained the dominant force in Languedoc. He became not merely a crusader, but a builder of a new order, reshaping the political and religious landscape of the south. His banners flew from Carcassonne to Toulouse, and his name was spoken with awe and fear. But his rise was also sowing the seeds of his downfall. The lords of Languedoc would not accept foreign domination forever. Count Raymond VI and his allies, though beaten down, were not destroyed. The people of the south, though cowed, were not broken, and in time resistance would grow strong enough to challenge Simon's rule. For now, however, Simon de Montfort stood at the height of his power. To his supporters, he was the champion of Christ, scourge of heresy, and a model of crusading zeal. To his enemies, he was a tyrant whose iron fist sought to crush the culture and freedom of the South. His rise marked a turning point in the Albigensian Crusade, a moment when the war became not only about faith, but about conquest, power, and the future of an entire region. In the summer of 1210, the Albigensian Crusade reached one of its most dramatic and tragic episodes, the Siege of Minerve. This mountain town, perched high above steep cliffs and surrounded by natural defences, had become a haven for Cathars. Its position made it difficult to attack, and its walls were fortified enough to withstand raiding bands. To the Crusaders, however, Minerve was more than just a stronghold. It was a symbol of resistance, a sanctuary where heretics could live openly, protected by sympathetic lords. Simon de Montfort, already establishing himself as the chief commander of the crusade, saw Minerve as a crucial target. With papal legates at his side, he led the army southward, determined to break the Cathar spirit once and for all. His forces surrounded the town, cutting off supplies and isolating its defenders. The siege dragged on through the summer heat. The people of Minerve endured hunger and thirst, their wells poisoned, their stores depleted. From the cliffs above, the Crusaders hurled projectiles with siege engines, battering walls and spreading terror among the inhabitants. Yet inside the town, the Cathar perfecti continued their calm devotion. They gathered their followers, prayed, and encouraged steadfastness, even in the face of certain defeat. As the weeks wore on, it became clear that Minerve could not hold. When the walls finally gave way, the defenders sought terms. Simon de Montfort, advised by papal representatives, agreed to spare the lives of the townspeople, but with one condition. The Cathar perfecti, the spiritual leaders of the sect, must renounce their faith and return to the Catholic Church. If they refused, they would face death. The offer was delivered to the Cathars, and the choice was laid before them. For the perfecti, the path of denial was unthinkable. Their entire lives had been devoted to the pursuit of spiritual purity. To betray that, to turn away from the truth as they understood it, would mean forsaking the very essence of salvation. One by one, more than 100 Cathar perfecti refused to recant. Chroniclers describe them walking calmly to the pyres prepared for them, singing prayers as the flames rose around them. Their followers watched in grief and awe as their leaders accepted death rather than compromise. In the minds of the Crusaders, this was proof of heretical stubbornness. But to those who survived, it became a testament of faith, a martyrdom that would echo for generations. The burning at Minerve shocked even some of the Crusaders. While they believed themselves to be fighting for God's truth, the willingness of the Cathars to die for their convictions unsettled many. How could people so serene in the face of death be entirely condemned? It was a question whispered but rarely spoken aloud, for the Church's stance was clear. Heresy must be eradicated, no matter how sincere its adherents. For the people of Languedoc, the fall of Minerve was another wound, another reminder of the relentless advance of the Northern Knights. Songs of lament spread through the countryside, telling of the perfecti who chose fire over betrayal. These martyrs, though erased from official chronicles, lived on in oral memory, shaping the identity of those who continued to resist. Simon de Montfort, however, saw Minerve as a triumph. It was another step in his campaign to dominate the south, another demonstration that resistance was futile. The papal legates praised him, and word of the victory spread north, encouraging more crusaders to join the cause. To them, Minerve was proof that God's will was being fulfilled through fire and steel. Yet beneath the ashes, the spirit of Catharism endured. Survivors scattered to other villages, carrying with them the stories of martyrdom and faith. Perfecti continued to preach in secret, traveling by night, gathering small groups of believers in barns and forests. If anything, the massacre at Minerve deepened the sense of persecution and solidified their belief that the material world was ruled by corruption. For what greater proof could there be than the sight of innocent souls burned alive by the supposed representatives of God on earth? The siege of Minerve marked a turning point in the Albigensian Crusade. It revealed both the ruthless determination of the Crusaders and the unshakable faith of the Cathars. It set a grim precedent for what was to come, for this was not the last time Cathars would choose death over recantation. More pyres would be lit in the years ahead, more martyrs made as the crusade spread deeper into the heart of Languedoc. For now, the flames of Minerve rose high into the summer sky, a beacon of both conquest and defiance. To the Crusaders, they were the light of divine justice. To the Cathars, they were the fire of truth, burning but never extinguished. By the year 1211, the Albigensian Crusade had transformed from a campaign of suppression into a full-scale war for the future of southern France. At its heart lay the great city of Toulouse, a centre of wealth, culture, and resistance. Here, the troubadours still sang, merchants thrived, and Cathar belief quietly spread despite the shadow of the Crusaders. To control Toulouse was to control the south, and both the Catholic Church and Simon de Montfort knew it. The city's ruler, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, was one of the most complex figures of the age. Accused repeatedly of harbouring heresy, excommunicated by the Pope, and despised by Crusaders, he nevertheless remained a powerful lord with strong support among his people. Raymond was pragmatic, sometimes negotiating with Rome, sometimes resisting, always trying to balance survival with the defense of his lands. His wavering stance made him seem untrustworthy to both allies and enemies, yet it also kept him alive in a world where missteps were fatal. Simon de Montfort, emboldened by his victories at Béziers, Carcassonne, and Minerve, turned his eyes to Toulouse. If he could seize the city, his dominance in the south would be complete. But Toulouse was no small fortress on a hilltop. It was a sprawling metropolis with thick walls, loyal defenders, and citizens who would not easily submit to a northern conqueror. The first attempts to bring Toulouse to heel came in 1211, when Simon led an army to its gates. Skirmishes broke out around the countryside, castles loyal to Raymond were besieged, and the tension mounted. Yet the city itself held firm. Inside its walls, people rallied to their count, determined not to surrender their way of life. Toulouse was not only defending land, it was defending identity, language, and a culture distinct from that of northern France. The conflict widened. Other lords of Languedoc, fearful of Simon's growing power, began to resist more actively. Battles erupted across the region, sieges dragged on for months, and both sides suffered heavy losses. It was not simply a war of religion anymore, it was a war of politics, land, and independence. The Pope's legates continued to push the crusade forward with unrelenting zeal. For them, the matter was clear. Toulouse must be subdued and heresy stamped out. But for the people of the city, the issue was more tangled. Many Catholics lived peacefully alongside Cathars, bound together by family ties and trade. To betray one was to betray the other. The Crusaders' brutal tactics, far from convincing the population, only hardened their resistance. In these years, Simon de Montfort's reputation reached its peak. To the church, he was praised as a model crusader, a new kind of knight who fought not for personal glory, but for faith. To his enemies, he was a relentless invader, stripping the south of its autonomy. Songs and poems circulated in Toulouse mocking the northerners, portraying them as greedy barbarians who destroyed a land of refinement and beauty. The troubadours became voices of protest, weaving satire and sorrow into their verses. One of the most dramatic moments came in 1211 at the siege of Lavaux, a castle near Toulouse. After a fierce resistance, the fortress fell. Hundreds of Cathar believers were executed, and the lady of the castle, Guillaume de Lavaux, was thrown into a well and stoned to death. This act shocked the region, demonstrating yet again the merciless nature of the crusade. It also strengthened Toulouse's determination to resist at all costs. Over the next years, the conflict expanded beyond Languedoc. Alliances shifted constantly. Sometimes the King of Aragon intervened, sometimes French nobles withdrew, sometimes local lords switched sides. The war became a tangled web of loyalties, with Cathar faith at the center, but politics pulling in every direction. Toulouse itself remained a beacon of defiance. Despite sieges, threats, and excommunication, the city did not fall easily. Raymond VI, though weakened, retained enough support to keep Simon at bay. And within the city walls, Cathars still found refuge. Their beliefs whispered in homes and preached in secret gatherings. The struggle for Toulouse marked a new phase in the Albigensian crusade. It was no longer about crushing scattered villages or isolated castles. It was about seizing one of the greatest cities of the south, a city whose fall or survival would determine the fate of the entire region. As the war dragged on, both sides grew hardened. The Crusaders became ever more ruthless, convinced they were instruments of divine justice. The people of Toulouse grew ever more defiant, convinced they were defending not only their city, but their way of life. The stage was set for years of bloodshed, sieges, and shifting fortunes. For now, the banners of Simon de Montfort flew across much of Languedoc. Yet in Toulouse, the people still raised their own, declaring in every act of resistance that their city would not easily be conquered. As the Albigensian crusade raged through the lands of Languedoc, it became increasingly clear that the conflict was not confined to questions of faith alone. The struggle was also a battle for political power, and the ripples spread far beyond the borders of southern France. Into this turbulent scene stepped the crown of Aragon, a kingdom whose influence stretched across the Pyrenees and into the Mediterranean. The ruler of Aragon at this time, King Peter II, was a monarch of considerable ambition. Known as Peter the Catholic for his piety and loyalty to Rome, he nevertheless had strong ties to the lords of Languedoc. His family intermarried with the nobility of the south, and his realm shared close cultural, linguistic, and economic bonds with Toulouse and its surrounding lands. For Peter, the rise of Simon de Montfort and the encroachment of northern French crusaders threatened not only his allies, but also the balance of power in the region. At first, Peter sought to act as mediator. He approached the Pope, hoping to secure peace and protect his vassals in Languedoc from the worst excesses of the crusade. But Innocent III, unwavering in his determination to eradicate heresy, refused to relent. The papacy viewed the presence of Catharism as a spiritual cancer, and no amount of diplomacy could persuade it otherwise. When it became clear that mediation had failed, Peter faced a difficult choice. To abandon his allies was to lose influence in Languedoc. To oppose the crusade was to risk conflict not only with Simon de Montfort, but also with Rome itself. In the end, the king chose to defend his southern allies, even if it meant challenging papal authority. By 1213, the tension erupted into open conflict. Simon de Montfort's armies were pressing hard against Toulouse and its supporters. Raymond VI, excommunicated and desperate, turned to Peter for aid. The king responded, gathering his forces and marching north across the Pyrenees to confront the Crusaders. His arrival brought hope to the besieged lords of Languedoc, who saw in him a champion capable of halting the advance of the Northern Knights. The confrontation came to a head at the Battle of Muret in September 1213. Peter commanded a coalition of southern lords and their troops, while Simon de Montfort led the Crusaders with characteristic discipline. Despite being outnumbered, Simon's forces were better organized, hardened by years of campaigning and guided by ruthless determination. The battle was swift and decisive. Peter, perhaps overconfident, led a daring cavalry charge against the Crusader lines. But the maneuver backfired. In the chaos, the king was cut off from his men and killed. His death sent shockwaves through the Allied army, and the coalition collapsed. The Crusaders seized victory, scattering their enemies and securing Simon de Montfort's dominance over the region. The fall of Peter II at Muret marked a turning point in the war. For the people of Languedoc, it was a crushing blow. The one monarch who might have checked Simon's ambitions was gone, and his kingdom of Aragon withdrew from the conflict. For Simon, it was the crowning triumph of his career, proof that God favoured his cause and that no earthly power could stand against the crusade. But the wider consequences were profound. With Aragon defeated, the balance of power in southern Europe shifted decisively toward northern France. The victory at Muret paved the way for greater French influence in Languedoc, bringing the once independent south under the shadow of the Capetian monarchy. What had begun as a war against heresy was becoming a war of annexation, drawing the region into the orbit of a growing French kingdom. For the papacy, the outcome was both a triumph and a complication. On the one hand, the crushing of Aragon's intervention ensured that the Cathars would find no powerful protector. On the other, the growing power of Simon de Montfort raised concerns. Was this northern noble fighting solely for the faith, or was he building a personal dominion that might rival even Rome's authority? The tension between papal approval and papal suspicion would soon come to the fore. In the south, however, the consequences were immediate. The death of Peter left Toulouse vulnerable, its allies shaken and its people uncertain of the future. Yet even in the wake of defeat, the Cathar faith endured. Secret meetings continued, the perfecti carried on their mission, and ordinary believers whispered prayers that the world's true God, the God of light, would one day prevail over the darkness. The role of Aragon in the Albigensian crusade was brief but dramatic, a reminder that the conflict was never only about religion. It was about kings and counts, alliances and betrayals, and the shifting map of medieval Europe. At Muret, the fate of Languedoc tilted toward conquest, and the dream of a free and independent South grew dimmer under the weight of Crusader victory. For nearly a decade, Simon de Montfort had been the scourge of Languedoc. His victories at Béziers, Carcassonne, Minerve, and Muret had made him the undisputed champion of the crusade, praised by the papacy and feared by the lords of the south. Yet his rule was never uncontested. Beneath his banners, resistance simmered, waiting for the moment to strike back. That moment came in 1218, when the city of Toulouse rose once more in defiance. After the death of King Peter II of Aragon at Muret, Simon de Montfort had consolidated his power. He claimed vast territories in the south, styling himself as a ruler in his own right. But the very scale of his ambition bred resentment. The people of Languedoc had endured years of sieges, massacres, and forced conversions. For them, Simon was not a savior, but a conqueror, and Toulouse remained the heart of resistance. In 1217, Count Raymond VI, long exiled and excommunicated, returned to Toulouse with the support of its citizens. The city, weary of northern domination, welcomed him back as their rightful lord. Simon de Montfort, enraged by this rebellion, gathered his forces and laid siege to Toulouse in the spring of 1218. The siege was brutal and drawn out. Simon's army built siege engines and bombarded the walls, while the defenders fought back with equal ferocity. Within the city, men, women, and even children joined in the defense. Chroniclers describe how citizens hurled stones, poured boiling water, and resisted with remarkable determination. Toulouse had suffered much, but now it would not fall without a fight. As the weeks dragged into months, the struggle became personal. Simon de Montfort was determined to crush Toulouse once and for all, to erase the symbol of southern defiance. Yet the defenders, united under Raymond VI, fought with the desperation of those who knew their survival depended on it. Then, on June 25, 1218, fate turned against the Crusader commander. During an assault on the city's defences, Simon was struck by a stone launched from a mangonel, a type of large catapult operated by the women of Toulouse. The projectile crushed his head, killing him instantly. The great Crusader, the hammer of heresy, fell not by sword or lance, but by a stone hurled from the walls of a city that refused to yield. The news spread quickly, electrifying the south. To the people of Toulouse, Simon's death was a miracle, proof that divine justice had intervened. Songs were sung of the women who manned the siege engines, their courage celebrated as the turning point of the war. To the Crusaders, it was a devastating blow. Their leader, their symbol of resolve, was gone. The papacy and northern France mourned the loss. Chroniclers sympathetic to the crusade painted Simon as a holy warrior, a martyr for the cause of Christendom. To his followers, his death was a tragedy that left the crusade leaderless. But to the people of Languedoc, it was liberation, a sign that resistance was not in vain. Simon's body was buried at Carcassonne, and his titles passed to his son, Amaury de Montfort. Yet Amaury lacked his father's charisma and iron will. Without Simon's leadership, the momentum of the crusade faltered. The lords of Languedoc, emboldened by Toulouse's survival, rallied once more. The dream of complete conquest slipped further from the grasp of the Crusaders. The death of Simon de Montfort was more than the loss of a commander. It was a turning point in the Albigensian crusade. It revealed the fragility of the Crusader cause, dependent as it was on the strength of one man's ambition. It also underscored the determination of the South, where even after years of devastation, the people of Toulouse refused to surrender. For the Cathars, Simon's fall did not bring an end to persecution, but it offered a glimmer of hope. If the mightiest of their enemies could be struck down, perhaps their faith would endure after all. In whispered prayers and secret gatherings, they remembered the day when the conqueror fell beneath the stones of Toulouse, and they saw in it a sign that the God of light had not abandoned them. The crusade would continue, led by others, but the death of Simon de Montfort marked the beginning of its decline. What had seemed unstoppable now showed cracks, and the struggle for the soul of Languedoc entered a new phase, one shaped less by conquest and more by the slow, grinding pressure of the Inquisition to come. With the death of Simon de Montfort in 1218, the crusade lost much of its ferocity, but the struggle was far from over. The south of France, though scarred and weakened, continued to resist. Yet even as the clash of armies began to fade, another, more insidious weapon was being sharpened: the Inquisition. Where swords and siege engines failed, the machinery of systematic investigation, interrogation, and fear would succeed. The Church had long struggled with how to deal with heresy. Local bishops were expected to root it out, but many were either negligent or sympathetic to their people. Others simply lacked the resources to track down hidden believers. Catharism was not always visible in the marketplace or the pulpit. It thrived in whispered meetings, in rural cottages, in the faith of artisans and merchants who quietly rejected the sacraments of the Catholic Church. To fight such a hidden enemy, New methods were required. The first steps toward what would become the Inquisition were taken at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, where Pope Innocent III decreed that heresy must be sought out actively, not merely punished when exposed. Bishops were charged with making yearly visits to their dioceses, examining the faith of their flock, and ensuring orthodoxy. But this system proved cumbersome and inconsistent. By the 1230s, the papacy sought a more organized solution. Pope Gregory IX established special papal agents known as inquisitors who operated independently of local bishops. These men, often drawn from the Dominican and Franciscan orders, were entrusted with full authority to identify, question, and punish heretics. The Dominicans in particular were valued for their intellectual training and zeal for doctrinal purity. They became the sharp edge of the Church's war against Catharism. The methods of the Inquisition were chilling. Communities were summoned to testify. Individuals suspected of heresy could be called before inquisitors, sometimes with little opportunity to defend themselves. Anonymous denunciations were permitted, and once accused, the burden of proof shifted heavily onto the suspect. Those who confessed and repented might be spared execution, but were often sentenced to harsh penances, wearing distinctive crosses on their clothing, pilgrimage, or imprisonment. Those who refused to recant, or who relapsed into heresy, faced the stake. Torture, though not initially sanctioned, became an accepted tool in the mid-13th century. The rationale was that the salvation of souls outweighed the suffering of the body. A confession extracted under torment was admissible as evidence, though it often produced words of desperation rather than truth. For the Cathars, who believed in the primacy of the spirit over the flesh, the cruelty of the Inquisition was both a trial and a grim validation of their worldview. The psychological impact of the Inquisition was immense. Entire villages lived in fear of denunciation. Neighbors became informants, families were divided, and trust was corroded. The Cathar communities, once resilient in open defiance, were forced into deeper secrecy. Perfects who once traveled openly, preaching and consoling the faithful, now moved under the cover of night, relying on a shrinking network of sympathizers. The case records of the Inquisition, preserved in meticulous detail, offer a haunting window into this world. Ordinary men and women, peasants, weavers, midwives, even minor nobles, appear in these documents, confessing their beliefs or naming others. Through these pages, we glimpse the human dimension of the struggle, the quiet faith of those who clung to Catharism despite the risks, the fear of those who wavered, and the ruthless efficiency of the inquisitors who dismantled an entire movement, one testimony at a time. Perhaps the most infamous inquisitor in Languedoc was Bernard Gui, a Dominican whose manual Practica Inquisitionis laid out procedures for identifying and punishing heresy. Popular culture would later remember him as a symbol of inquisitorial cruelty, though he saw himself as a defender of truth. For Gui and others like him, the eradication of heresy was not merely an act of discipline, but a sacred duty. By the mid-13th century, the Inquisition had achieved what armies could not: the systematic destruction of Catharism as a living faith. Castles might fall, lords might rebel, but the relentless pursuit of heretics wore down the movement until only remnants survived. The fires of Montségur and the records of the Inquisitors became the final chapters of a once vibrant tradition. The rise of the Inquisition marks one of the darkest turns in medieval history. It represented the institutionalization of suspicion, the triumph of surveillance over tolerance, and the extension of papal authority into the most intimate corners of daily life. For the Cathars, it was the beginning of the end. For Europe, it was the birth of a machinery of control that would echo far beyond Languedoc, shaping the very way the Church dealt with dissent for centuries to come. High in the Pyrenean foothills, perched upon a rocky peak more than 3,000 feet above the valleys below, stood Montségur, a fortress that became both the sanctuary and the symbol of Cathar resistance. To the faithful, it was not merely a stronghold of stone, but a beacon of their enduring spirit, a citadel where the light of their beliefs still burned, even as persecution closed in from every side. By the early 1240s, Catharism had been battered by crusade and inquisition. Its open communities were shattered, its leaders scattered. Yet Montségur remained. The fortress, held by Cathar sympathizers of the local nobility, sheltered many of the perfects, the spiritual elite who guided the movement. Within its walls they conducted ceremonies, offered consolation to believers, and maintained the fragile continuity of their faith. But the Church and the French crown could not tolerate such defiance. Montségur was more than an isolated fortress. It was a challenge to their authority, a lingering reminder that heresy had not yet been extinguished. And so, in 1243, a great siege was mounted. The besieging force was commanded by Hugues des Arcis, the Seneschal of Carcassonne, and Pierre Amiel, the Archbishop of Narbonne. They brought with them seasoned soldiers, engineers, and the full support of the Crusader cause. Facing them, the defenders of Montségur numbered only a few hundred, soldiers, townsfolk, and Cathar perfects alike. Yet the natural strength of the mountain, combined with the determination of those who held it, promised a long and bitter struggle. For months, the fortress withstood the assault. The attackers encircled the mountain, cutting off supplies, while siege engines hurled stones at the walls. The defenders fought back with courage, launching sorties and maintaining their faith despite dwindling resources. Chroniclers speak of the harsh winter endured on the exposed heights, where hunger and cold gnawed at the besieged. Yet within the walls, the Cathars continued to gather, reciting prayers, offering the consolamentum to the dying, and encouraging one another with the conviction that their suffering had meaning. By March 1244, after nearly 10 months of resistance, the situation had grown desperate. The besiegers managed to seize a key outpost on the slopes, bringing their engines within range of the fortress itself. Stones pounded the defenses, and starvation loomed. The defenders realized that their position was no longer tenable. Negotiations began, and the terms agreed upon were grim. The fortress would surrender, but those who renounced their heresy would be spared. Those who refused would face execution. It was at this moment that the Cathar perfects made their choice. Rather than recant, they embraced martyrdom. Some received the consolamentum for the first time, knowing it would also be their last. In their belief system, to die purified by this final sacrament was to transcend the corrupt world of matter and return to the realm of light. Thus, when the gates of Montségur opened, more than 200 Cathars descended not to freedom, but to fire. On March 16, 1244, a great pyre was erected at the foot of the mountain. Chroniclers record that 220 Cathars, men and women alike, walked into the flames rather than betray their faith. Some held hands, others sang hymns, all faced the fire with calm resolve. To their persecutors, it was a triumph, the final eradication of heresy from its last refuge. To the survivors who watched from the valleys, it was an unforgettable act of collective sacrifice. The fall of Montségur became legend. To the Cathar faithful who remained in hiding, it was a symbol of unwavering devotion, proof that their beliefs were worth more than life itself. To later generations, it came to embody the tragic nobility of a persecuted faith, crushed by the powers of church and crown, yet undefeated in spirit. Even centuries later, whispers persisted that treasures, Perhaps sacred texts or even the Holy Grail itself had been spirited away from Montségur before the end, fueling myths and mysteries that endure to this day. In truth, Montségur was less a fortress than a crucible where the Cathar story reached its climax. With its fall, organized Catharism in Languedoc was broken. The faith would linger in scattered pockets, but never again would it hold a citadel. Never again would it openly defy the Church. The smoke of Montségur's pyre marked the twilight of a movement that had once challenged the foundations of medieval Christianity. Yet in that twilight, a strange light remained. For those who remember, Montségur is not just a ruin upon a mountain, but a monument to conscience, to the power of belief carried to its ultimate consequence. The flames that consumed the Cathars did not erase their story. Instead, they etched it forever into the memory of Europe. After the fiery end at Montségur in 1244, many believed that Catharism had been extinguished once and for all. The fortress was gone, its perfects consumed by fire, its name etched into the chronicles as the final chapter of a doomed heresy. Yet history is rarely so absolute. Though Catharism as an organized force had been crushed, traces of it survived, in whispers, in secret gatherings, in the memories of those who could not let go of the light they had once seen. The fall of Montségur scattered the faithful across the hills and valleys of Languedoc. Some fled into the mountains, taking refuge in remote villages where the arm of the Inquisition reached only with difficulty. Others sought safety in neighboring regions, into the Pyrenees, over the border into Aragon, or further still into Lombardy in northern Italy, where dualist traditions had already taken root. In these places, fragments of Cathar communities clung to life, often blending into local society while maintaining their beliefs in secret. For the perfects who escaped the siege, survival meant constant movement. They could no longer preach openly, but they continued to administer the consolamentum to the faithful, often in the dead of night, in barns, caves, or remote farmhouses. One such refuge was the Grotta de l'Ombrives, a vast cave system in the Pyrenees that local legend associates with Cathar fugitives. Here, far from the prying eyes of inquisitors, rituals could be conducted and faith preserved, if only for a little longer. The Inquisition, however, was relentless. By the mid-13th century, it had developed an efficient system of surveillance. Suspected villages were interrogated, entire populations summoned to testify, and any whisper of sympathy for Cathar ideas was enough to draw suspicion. Those who harbored perfects risked imprisonment or death, yet many continued to offer shelter. The faith had become something intimate and fragile, woven into the fabric of family life, carried forward not in public sermons but in quiet acts of loyalty and memory. Some communities adapted by disguising their beliefs. Outwardly, they conformed to Catholic practice, attending Mass, receiving the sacraments, while inwardly holding to Cathar teachings. This double life was perilous, but it allowed the essence of their faith to linger undetected. In this way, Catharism began to resemble the secret religions of antiquity, passed from generation to generation in whispered traditions rather than public institutions. In northern Italy, Cathar groups known as the Albigensians of Lombardy maintained a stronger presence. Here, in the bustling towns of Milan and Cremona, sympathetic networks provided space for Cathar perfects to move and preach. Though still hunted, they found relative safety in the patchwork of Italian politics, where local rulers sometimes tolerated them as a counterbalance to papal authority. For a time, these communities kept the Cathar spirit alive with greater resilience than in France. But even in Lombardy, the tide turned. Papal pressure increased, inquisitors crossed the Alps, and rulers eager to prove their loyalty to Rome clamped down on heresy. By the late 13th century, the movement there too was fading, reduced to scattered individuals rather than thriving communities. The legacy of these survivors is difficult to trace, precisely because survival required secrecy. The Inquisition's records are often our only window, and they tell the story from the perspective of the persecutors. Yet even these documents reveal moments of extraordinary courage. We read of villagers who sheltered perfects for decades, of women who risked everything to carry food and messages, of men who refused to betray their friends even under torture. Each act of defiance was small, but together they wove a hidden tapestry of resistance. By the 14th century, Catharism had all but disappeared as a living faith. Yet echoes remained. Some scholars argue that elements of Cathar belief may have filtered into later movements, the Waldensians, the Lollards, and even the Protestant Reformation centuries later. While these connections are debated, the persistence of dualist and anti-clerical ideas suggests that Catharism's disappearance was not as total as the Inquisitors might have wished. For the survivors themselves, the memory of Montségur loomed large. The story of those who chose fire over renunciation was told and retold, shaping a narrative of martyrdom that gave meaning to suffering. Even in hidden communities, the example of the martyrs gave courage. If they could endure the flames, others could endure silence, exile, or fear. In the end, the survivors and their hidden communities did not preserve Catharism as a mass movement, but they ensured it was not entirely erased. Like embers buried beneath ashes, their faith smouldered quietly for generations, waiting for curious eyes in later centuries to uncover the traces. The ruins of Montségur, the caves of the Pyrenees, and the pages of inquisitorial records all bear silent witness to those who carried the light a little longer, even in the darkest of times. As centuries passed, the Cathars faded from the stage of history. Their castles lay in ruins, their communities dispersed, and their names remembered chiefly in the records of inquisitors. Yet paradoxically, it was in disappearance that they began to acquire a second life, one woven not from the fragile fabric of history, but from the imagination of later generations. Out of silence grew myth, and the Cathars were reborn as symbols of mystery, wisdom, and sometimes fantasy. The first misunderstanding lies in the very word Cathar. Medieval sources rarely use it. To their opponents, they were heretics, Manichaeans, or Albigensians, named after the town of Albi. Only later did the label Cathar, derived from the Greek katharoi, meaning pure ones, become common. It gave the impression of a unified, self-conscious movement, but in reality, the groups lumped together as Cathars were diverse, spread across regions, and varied in practice. The neatness of the label is a product of hindsight, shaped as much by inquisitors as by modern scholars. Another misunderstanding concerns their beliefs. Popular imagination often portrays the Cathars as radical dualists, convinced that the world of matter was wholly evil, created by a malevolent demiurge. Certainly some strands of Cathar thought leaned strongly in this direction, echoing earlier dualist traditions like the Bogomils. But others embraced a softer dualism, acknowledging the material world's corruption, but not attributing it to an entirely separate god of darkness. For many, the line between radical and moderate dualism blurred, and what we call Cathar theology was far from uniform. The image of the Cathars as proto-modern freethinkers is another distortion. In some 19th and 20th century retellings, they are depicted as champions of democracy, rationalism, or even proto-Protestantism, standing bravely against the oppressive Catholic Church. While it is true they criticized the wealth of the clergy and rejected certain Catholic sacraments, the Cathars were not secular reformers. They were deeply religious, intensely spiritual, and profoundly ascetic. Their worldview was not progressive by modern standards, but rooted in medieval ideas of cosmic struggle between light and darkness. Perhaps the most enduring myth is the association of the Cathars with the Holy Grail. In the 20th century, authors like Otto Rahn popularized the idea that Montségur was the hiding place of a sacred treasure, possibly the Grail itself, spirited away before the fortress fell. This romantic tale, woven from fragments of medieval legend and speculative connections, has inspired countless novels, documentaries, and even conspiracy theories linking the Cathars to the Knights Templar. Yet historians find little evidence for such claims. The Grail, as a literary motif, belongs to the realm of Arthurian romance, not Cathar theology. Still, the allure of a hidden treasure at Montségur continues to capture imaginations. Linked to this is the tendency to see the Cathars as keepers of secret wisdom, a lost Christianity purer than the Church of Rome, guardians of truths suppressed by orthodoxy. While it is true their teachings differed radically from Catholic doctrine, the notion of a lost gospel preserved intact by the Cathars is largely invention. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts in 1945, with their genuine Gnostic writings, has often been anachronistically tied to Catharism, even though the movements were separated by a millennium and distinct cultural contexts. The hunger for hidden knowledge, however, has ensured the Cathars a place in modern esotericism and New Age thought. The romanticization of the Cathars also owes much to the 19th century revival of Occitan culture. Writers and poets in southern France, eager to celebrate their regional heritage, recast the Cathars as noble martyrs of freedom, victims of northern oppression. In this telling, the Albigensian crusade became less about theology and more about cultural conquest, the crushing of a vibrant Occitan identity by a centralized French monarchy allied with Rome. There is truth in this narrative. The crusade undeniably weakened local autonomy. Yet the Cathars themselves were primarily a religious movement, not political revolutionaries. In modern times, tourism has added another layer of myth. The castles of Languedoc, Pays-Repertus, Quéribus, and above all Montségur, are marketed as Cathar castles, drawing visitors with the promise of mystery and tragedy. While some of these sites did shelter Cathars, others were later royal fortresses only tenuously connected to the heresy. The label Cathar Castle is as much a creation of the 20th century as it is a reflection of medieval reality. Still, myths, however distorted, reveal something important. The Cathars continue to matter long after their disappearance. To some, they are heretics. To others, saints. To some, they are dualists who despise the material world. To others, enlightened mystics who grasped a hidden truth. History, memory, and imagination intertwine until the line between fact and legend blurs. Perhaps that is the final irony. A movement once silenced by fire and sword has endured, not through the survival of its churches, but through the stories told about it. Misunderstood, romanticized, and mythologized, the Cathars have become more than a medieval heresy. They have become a mirror onto which each generation projects its longings for purity, freedom, and hidden wisdom. Though the last flames at Montségur were extinguished in 1244, the Cathars were not entirely erased. Their physical communities dissolved, their leaders executed or driven into hiding, but their ideas, symbols, and stories echoed onward in surprising ways. History does not end with disappearance. It transforms, passing fragments of belief into new contexts, reshaped by those who inherit them. One of the most direct continuities can be found in the Waldensians, a movement founded in the late 12th century by Peter Waldo of Lyon. Like the Cathars, the Waldensians rejected the wealth of the clergy, emphasized apostolic poverty, and sought to return to the simplicity of the early church. Unlike the Cathars, they did not embrace dualism, but they too faced condemnation from Rome and persecution from inquisitors. In some regions, especially northern Italy, Waldensians and Cathars overlapped, sometimes cooperating in opposition to Catholic authority. Though distinct, the parallel struggles suggest that the Cathar story helped set the stage for broader movements of dissent. Later still, the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century revived themes long associated with Cathar criticism: rejection of clerical excess, emphasis on scripture over hierarchy, and suspicion of sacramental rituals. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin did not draw directly from Cathar sources. Indeed, they would likely have condemned Cathar theology, but the memory of heretical resistance lingered as a shadowy prelude. In Catholic polemic, Protestants were sometimes branded as new Albigensians, a reminder that the association between heresy and rebellion had not been forgotten. Beyond theology, Catharism also left its imprint on literature and art. The tragic fall of Montségur and the heroism of its martyrs inspired legends among the Occitan people. Troubadour poetry, though flourishing mostly before the Crusade, became retrospectively linked with the Cathars, as if their songs of love and longing carried hidden traces of dualist spirituality. In the 19th century, Romantic writers seized on this idea, weaving Catharism into tales of doomed beauty and resistance against tyranny. Writers like Napoleon Peyrat in the mid-19th century portrayed the Cathars as proto-national heroes of the Languedoc, defenders not just of faith, but of regional identity against northern domination. His history of the Albigensians turned the crusade into a moral drama of freedom crushed by power, heretics recast as martyrs of liberty. Though historically imprecise, Peyrat's work resonated with a France wrestling with centralization and regional memory, ensuring the Cathars' story remained part of cultural consciousness. In the 20th century, echoes of Catharism took more esoteric turns. Some writers connected the Cathars with the Holy Grail, suggesting Montségur as the last hiding place of a mystical treasure. This fusion of Cathar history with Arthurian legend captured popular imagination, influencing works ranging from scholarly speculation to novels like those by Graham Hancock or the mystical interpretations of Otto Rahn, whose writings linked Catharism to Nazi occultism. Though historically tenuous, these associations ensured that Cathars remained part of modern myth-making, their story endlessly reinterpreted. Even in mainstream literature, Catharism has surfaced as a symbol of purity, resistance, and tragedy. Novels such as Zoe Oldenburg's The World Is Not Enough and Kate Moss's Labyrinth cast the Cathars in dramatic narratives, blending historical detail with romantic invention. In these retellings, the Cathars are often less a medieval sect than a canvas onto which modern anxieties about power, faith, and freedom are projected. Meanwhile, scholars have explored Catharism with increasing rigor, uncovering not only its theological roots but also its cultural echoes. The meticulous records of inquisitors, once instruments of destruction, have become invaluable sources for reconstructing Cathar belief and daily life. In these pages, the voices of ordinary believers, artisans, peasants, and women speak across centuries, their testimony preserving what fire and sword sought to erase. The echoes of Catharism also persist in regional memory. In southern France today, Montségur and other so-called Cathar castles attract pilgrims of history and spirituality alike. Some come seeking the romance of legend, others the solemn weight of martyrdom. Festivals, reenactments, and museums keep the story alive, often blurring the line between history and heritage. For the people of Languedoc, the Cathars are part of a cultural identity that endures, symbols of a past when their land stood defiant against northern conquest. Perhaps the most profound echo is less tangible: the idea that truth, however persecuted, cannot be extinguished. The Cathars were silenced, their books destroyed, their communities dismantled. Yet their story survived, not in the way they might have imagined, but in the persistence of memory, the fascination of later generations, and the conviction that voices once crushed can still be heard. In literature, legend, and even conspiracy theory, the Cathars continue to live. They are remembered as duelists, as martyrs, as heretics, as saints. Each retelling reshapes them, each echo distorts yet preserves. And in this ongoing reinterpretation, the Cathars reveal something universal: the human longing for purity, justice, and transcendence, even in the face of overwhelming power. While the Cathars were extinguished as an organized community in the 13th century, the traces of their existence still cling to the stones, manuscripts, and landscapes of southern France. Archaeology and modern scholarship have attempted to piece together this lost world, not merely to satisfy curiosity, but to understand how ideas thought to be erased could still resonate centuries later. The most striking material reminders are the so-called Cathar castles, scattered across the rugged hills of the Languedoc and Ariège. These imposing fortresses, Montségur, Pérepertus, Quéribus, and others, were not originally built by the Cathars themselves. Most were constructed or refortified by local lords, who sometimes sheltered Cathar believers during the crusade. Yet over time, they have become inextricably linked with the memory of the sect. Their ruined walls clinging to sheer cliffs suggest both resistance and vulnerability. To stand before Montségur's steep ascent is to feel the weight of legend pressing upon history. Excavations at Montségur and other sites have revealed foundations of medieval living quarters, traces of hearths, fragments of pottery, and defensive works. None of these items explicitly prove Cathar religious practice, but they anchor the memory of the people who once lived, suffered, and died there. In this way, archaeology provides the stage upon which imagination can project the drama of persecution and faith. More tangible evidence lies in the manuscript tradition. The Cathars produced little writing themselves, partly because of their emphasis on oral transmission, and partly because of the destruction of their works by inquisitors. Yet fragments survive: prayers, ritual texts, and above all, inquisitorial records. These grim documents, created to suppress heresy, have become a lifeline for modern historians. In them we hear the questions posed by inquisitors and the halting replies of peasants, artisans, and nobles accused of heresy. One example is the register of Jacques Fournier, Bishop of Pamiers, in the early 14th century. This meticulous record, later used when Fournier became Pope Benedict XII, captures the daily life of suspected heretics: women accused of hosting clandestine gatherings, men who traveled to receive the consolamentum, families torn between Catholic conformity and hidden sympathy. Though intended as evidence for prosecution, the register preserves voices otherwise lost to history. For archaeologists of the mind, these words are artifacts as precious as pottery shards. Modern interest in the Cathars surged in the 19th century, when Romantic writers and regional historians sought to recover the suppressed past of Occitania. Their work was not always accurate, but it fueled a fascination that endures today. Tourists travel the Cathar country, following marked routes that link castles, villages, and museums. Local economies benefit from this blend of heritage and myth, as visitors climb ancient steps and imagine themselves in the footsteps of heretical believers. Scholars, too, have approached Catharism with renewed rigor. 20th century historians debated whether Cathar dualism represented a coherent theology imported from Bogomilism in the Balkans, or whether it was a construct exaggerated by inquisitors. Archaeological finds, combined with textual study, have nuanced these debates. While it is clear that dualist ideas circulated widely, Catharism was not monolithic. Beliefs varied across regions and generations. This fluidity makes the task of reconstruction difficult, yet also compelling. Beyond scholarship, modern spiritual movements have drawn inspiration from the Cathars. New Age groups, esoteric societies, and seekers of alternative spirituality sometimes claim lineage from Cathar teachings. Montségur has even been described as a place of pilgrimage, not only for historians, but for those seeking mystical energy. Each solstice, gatherings are held near the fortress, blending memory with modern ritual. Though these practices owe more to imagination than historical continuity, they demonstrate the enduring power of the Cathar story to evoke longing for purity and transcendence. Archaeology has also been drawn into the orbit of myth. Treasure hunters have speculated about hidden relics at Montségur, fueled by legends of the Holy Grail or lost manuscripts smuggled away before the final siege. Excavations have uncovered nothing of the sort, yet the persistent rumors highlight the symbolic richness of Cathar ruins. To many, these stones are not just ruins, but gateways to secrets, waiting to be revealed. What then is the true legacy of Cathar archaeology? It is not in discovering golden chalices or hidden scrolls, but in grounding myth with material reality. To see the outline of a hearth, the worn step of a stair, the rough wall of a castle, is to bridge centuries. It reminds us that the Cathars were not abstractions or legends, but men and women who cooked, worked, argued, prayed, and resisted. Their story is one of flesh and stone, not only of doctrine and fire. In this sense, archaeology serves both history and humanity. It resists the erasures of time and power, allowing voices once silenced to whisper again through broken walls and fragile words. And perhaps this is why modern interest in the Cathars remains so keen. Their world was destroyed, yet not obliterated. Enough remains, stone and parchment, memory and myth, to invite us back into their presence, to wander the ruins and wonder what it meant to live and to die as a Cathar. The Cathars, once denounced as dangerous heretics, now live a second life as cultural icons. In modern imagination, they have become symbols of purity, resistance, hidden wisdom, and even mystical guardians of secrets. Their presence in popular culture demonstrates how history can be reinterpreted, reshaped, and sometimes distorted to serve new purposes. One of the most fertile grounds for Cathar reinvention has been literature. In the 19th century, Romantic writers rediscovered the Cathars as tragic heroes. Instead of dangerous duelists, they were cast as noble defenders of liberty and love, crushed by tyranny. Napoleon Peyrat's History of the Albigensians painted the Cathars as martyrs of the French South, defenders of a regional identity suppressed by northern power. His account was historically imprecise, but it inspired generations of readers and reinforced a sense of cultural pride in Languedoc. In the 20th century, the Cathars entered the realm of historical fiction and thrillers. Zoe Oldenburg's The World Is Not Enough, 1947, offered a vivid reconstruction of Cathar life, blending scholarly insight with dramatic storytelling. Later, novels like Kate Moss's Labyrinth, 2005, wove the Cathar story into modern mysteries, connecting medieval heresy with contemporary quests for meaning. These works captivated global audiences, ensuring that the Cathars were no longer a niche subject but a recurring motif in popular historical fiction. Perhaps the most sensational reimagining came through the Holy Grail legends. In the 1930s, German writer Otto Rahn argued that Montségur was the true hiding place of the Grail, reinterpreting the Cathar resistance as part of a cosmic battle for spiritual treasure. His ideas, though speculative, attracted interest from the Nazi regime, which was fascinated by esoteric myths. Though discredited academically, Rahn's writings seeded a wave of speculation that linked Cathars to Grail legends, secret knowledge, and hidden treasures. These themes resurfaced in the late 20th century in works such as Holy Blood, Holy Grail, 1982, by Michael Bagan, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln. The book suggested connections between Catharism, the Grail, and secret lineages of Christ. While historians dismissed it as pseudo-history, its influence was immense, inspiring Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, 2003, one of the most widely read novels of the 21st century. In this way, Cathars became part of global popular culture, transformed into symbols of mystery, secrecy, and resistance to orthodox authority. Beyond novels, Cathars also appear in film and television. Documentaries often present them as tragic martyrs, while fictionalized accounts weave their story into broader narratives of hidden truth. Episodes of history-focused series on channels like National Geographic or the BBC have introduced millions of viewers to the Cathar story, often highlighting the dramatic siege of Montségur and the romance of lost knowledge. Though simplified, these portrayals keep the memory alive in accessible ways. Music, too, has not been immune. Several modern artists, particularly in France, have composed songs and albums inspired by Cathar themes. Folk musicians evoke the memory of Occitania, while more experimental genres use Catharism as a metaphor for purity, rebellion, or mystical longing. The ruins of Montségur sometimes serve as venues for concerts or cultural festivals, blurring the line between entertainment and commemoration. In tourism and branding, the Cathars have become part of regional identity. The Pays Cathar, Cathar country, is a label used to market the castles and landscapes of southern France. Visitors walk marked trails, attend reenactments, and buy souvenirs linked to Cathar heritage. For some, this is a commercial exploitation of tragedy. For others, it is a way of keeping history alive, blending memory with modern economy. Modern spiritual movements also claim inspiration from Catharism. Some New Age groups see the Cathars as precursors of alternative spirituality, guardians of secret wisdom, or models of pure living. Pilgrimages to Montségur are not only historical but spiritual, with participants seeking energy, enlightenment, or symbolic rebirth. These practices, though disconnected from medieval theology, show how the Cathar story resonates with contemporary quests for authenticity and meaning. What is striking is how far the Cathars have traveled in cultural imagination, from feared heretics to romantic martyrs, from obscure sect to global symbol. Their story demonstrates how history is not fixed but constantly reinterpreted. The Cathars of the 13th century would scarcely recognize the Cathars of 21st century novels, films, and festivals, yet in this transformation lies a paradoxical survival. Erased by fire, they live on in story. Popular culture does not preserve the Cathars as they truly were, but it keeps their memory alive in forms that touch millions. For scholars, this poses challenges. How to separate myth from reality, legend from history. For ordinary people, however, it means that the Cathars remain part of the collective imagination, a reminder of humanity's enduring fascination with the forbidden, the pure, and the tragic. In the end, the Cathars in modern popular culture reflect not only the past, but also the present. Our longing for hidden truths, our suspicion of authority, and our attraction to stories of noble defeat. And so, through novels, films, music, and myth, the Cathars continue to conquer quietly, not with swords or sermons, but with the power of narrative. The story of the Cathars is, at its heart, both fragile and enduring. Fragile because their communities were crushed, their leaders executed, their writings destroyed, and their memory nearly erased. Enduring because across centuries their name, their courage, and their vision of an alternative world have never fully vanished. Instead, they linger, in ruins and records, in legend and literature, in scholarship and popular imagination. What lessons can we draw from this strange survival? The first is the power of conviction. The Cathars were not soldiers or kings, but ordinary men and women who believed that life could be lived differently, that purity, simplicity, and spiritual truth mattered more than wealth or power. Even under the threat of persecution, they persisted in their faith, quietly welcoming traveling perfecti, gathering in homes and passing on prayers. Their courage reminds us that conviction does not always require victory to have meaning. Sometimes it is the endurance of belief, even in defeat, that shapes history. The second lesson is the fragility of tolerance. The Cathars flourished in a society that for a time tolerated difference. The south of France was a crossroads of cultures: Catholic orthodoxy, Jewish scholarship, Muslim influence from across the Pyrenees, and local traditions. Yet tolerance proved vulnerable to fear, political ambition, and the demands of authority. The Albigensian crusade demonstrated how swiftly coexistence could be replaced by violence, how religion could be harnessed to conquest, and how dissent could be silenced by fire. This warning is not confined to the 13th century. It speaks to all times when difference is treated not as enrichment, but as a threat. The third lesson is the resilience of memory. The Church sought to obliterate the Cathars, but in doing so, it preserved their voices in inquisitorial records, created martyrs whose stories inspired later generations, and built ruins that became monuments. History has a strange irony. Attempts to destroy can sometimes guarantee survival, though in altered form. For the Cathars, the destruction of their world ensured that their tragedy would echo across centuries. Another lesson lies in the complexity of truth. The Cathars of history and the Cathars of legend are not the same. Scholars debate the precise details of their theology, while novels and myths weave them into tales of grails and secrets. Both the careful historian and the imaginative storyteller have roles to play. The historian grounds us in what can be known, the testimonies, the rituals, the events. The storyteller shows us how the Cathar story continues to live in human imagination, inspiring questions about purity, resistance, and hidden truth. Together, they remind us that history is both fact and meaning, evidence and interpretation. Finally, the Cathar story offers a reflection on the human longing for transcendence. Their dualism, however stark, expressed a profound dissatisfaction with the brokenness of the world. They looked at suffering, greed, and violence, and concluded that the world itself was flawed. Their solution was radical, a total rejection of material existence in favor of spiritual liberation. Few could live by such a demanding creed, yet many sympathized. In their rejection of compromise, the Cathars held up a mirror to humanity's yearning for a purer life. And so, what remains of the Cathars today? Not a living church, not an unbroken line of doctrine, but a story of people who dared to imagine differently. A story of power that crushed dissent with fire and sword. A story of ruins that still stand against the sky, whispering of courage and tragedy. As you drift into rest, let the memory of Montségur's burning embers settle in your mind, not as despair, but as a quiet recognition. The Cathars remind us that ideas cannot be entirely destroyed, that even voices silenced can be heard again, that history's shadows can illuminate our present. The Cathars may be gone, but their echo lingers. It lingers in the stones of castles, in the pages of inquisitors, in the novels of writers, in the imagination of seekers. It lingers in our own questions about power, faith, truth, and freedom. And perhaps that is their final victory, not to have conquered the world, but to have left behind a story that refuses to die.